Here's how Syracuse football can start games on time.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are going to go over how Syracuse football can still make this a successful season. We'll talk about the offensive and defensive line play and how they can get better over there on both sides of the front. But first, we're going to start off with how Syracuse football can start games on time, because for the last 3 weeks, they have not been starting at the kickoff time. I don't know what they're doing before kickoff, but whatever it is, they are not starting when the game actually starts. And we saw that problem fester against Boston College. And it's one of the many reasons why Syracuse football lost that game yesterday. Before we get to all that, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Syracuse football comes off a disappointing 37-31 loss at Boston College yesterday. And the reason why I think it's disappointing is because many people, including myself, thought Syracuse was going to win the game. Even though they were a 1.5-point underdog on FanDuel, I still thought that Syracuse was going to, pull off a road upset against Boston College. But credit to Boston College, they had a clear game plan, and they won the game. One of the reasons why they won the game is because, did they really start fast? I don't know. But they got off to a 14-0 lead, and they were able to just hang on tight and win the game 37-31. For the last 3 weeks, Syracuse football, as I have said already on this podcast, and as I repeated plenty of times on yesterday's post-game reaction show, and you can still check that out, Syracuse football is not starting games on time. They are not. The last 3 games, Syracuse has been outscored 38-0 in the first quarter. That's not very good. That is obviously not a winning formula, and there's a reason why they're 1-2 in the last 3, right? It's obviously part of the reason why they lost to Pitt, although that was just a bad game all around. They fell behind to Boston College. Hughes was fortunate enough to get a win over Virginia Tech. And Fran Brown said in his post-game press conference yesterday that he's got to go back to the drawing board. He doesn't necessarily know how Syracuse can start games faster. And oddly enough, I had to look this up because it's mainly an offensive issue, because the Syracuse defense, to their credit, has not allowed an opening drive touchdown or even any opening drive points since week 2 against Georgia Tech. That means the first time that Syracuse's defense touches the field, they're not allowing any points. That streak almost ended yesterday against Boston College, but they missed a 29-yard field goal. Guess what? In the box score, it says they didn't score on their first drive. Right? So it's mainly an offensive thing. So here are 2 ways I think Syracuse football can start better, at least on offense. All right? Number 1, I would get more creativity in the offense early. We've seen Jeff Nixon get into his bag. For those that don't know, Jeff Nixon is the Syracuse football offensive coordinator. He calls creative plays. I think we can all agree on that, right? We've seen some trickery. We've seen Dan VIllari usage and Wildcat. We've seen trickery, right? We've seen some creativity over there. But I think for the first drive, because they're trying to get into a rhythm, it gets a little bit stale and a little predictable, so the defense knows what's coming. At least in the last 3 games, that's what I have seen. In the second quarter, Kyle McCord had that awesome misdirection run, right? That was incredible. It was like a fake double reverse, and then Kyle McCord ended up scrambling for almost 30 yards. Opening drive, third quarter, this was only a 5-yard play, but it was a play action screen to the backside to Trevor Pena. And I thought it worked really well. It only got 5 yards, but still, it was 5 yards on a 1st and 10 play, and it was a little bit creative. You get 5 yards out of it. I want to see Syracuse get creative earlier in the game. That's my point. It's not that they don't run creative plays ever. They do. I just pointed out a couple examples against Boston College yesterday. But they don't do it right away, right? They do it in the second quarter. They do it in the third quarter. And I understand you want to get into a rhythm on offense. You want to hit those short passing plays. You want to try to get the run game going. I get it. But it's been 3 games that your offense has not scored in the first quarter. So maybe you might want to do something a little bit differently, right? That's all I'm saying. Maybe you get a little bit more creative on offense in the beginning of games, and you can start faster, particularly on offense, right? Number 2, and we'll get into the offensive line play more in depth in the next segment, okay? But number 2 is they got to slow down the pass rush. I think that Syracuse football, particularly early in the game, they really struggle handling teams' pass rush. They really do, especially in the last 3. We saw Pitt very early on establish front. We saw against Virginia Tech, Syracuse couldn't really move against their front. And then, of course, against Boston College, they couldn't move the ball against their front. Couldn't do it, right? So I think you got to help the offensive line a little bit more. I think that's what it really comes down to. We saw it a lot of times against Boston College yesterday, a lot of empty sets. What do I mean? What's an empty set? Well, it means Kyle McCord's in the shotgun. There's no one to his left. There's no one to his right. That means all 5 offensive linemen, unless you pull in a tight end like a Dan VIllari or Oronde Gadsden, there's only going to be 5 blockers. And Syracuse football's offensive line is not exactly the greatest unit in the world. So you don't want to do that. So early often in games, I'm not saying you got to do it the entirety of the game, but if you want to establish yourselves up front early on and start better in games, not being outscored 38-0 in the last 3, I think what you got to do is you got to help out the offensive line. That means no more empty sets, more design rollout plays. That was a great adjustment that Jeff Nixon did at the beginning of the third quarter. We saw a couple of design rollouts from Kyle McCord. Now, there are pros and cons to a rollout, right? If you roll out, obviously that's going to take away half the field, right? If you roll out to your right, you don't want your quarterback throwing back to the left. That's usually that's like a rule number 1 of quarterback play, a cardinal sin. Do not throw across your body, right? So it's a little bit predictable in terms of where you're going to throw the ball. However, when you roll out the quarterback, it helps out the offensive line because the quarterback's not a sitting duck in the pocket. So you could do that. More short passes. Short, quick. Now, they try that at times, but you could do that, right? Those are just ways you can slow down the pass rush. But the point being is that in order for this offense to start games better, I think they got to do 2 things. 1, get creative earlier. And number 2 is you got to slow down a team's pass rush. I think those have been the 2 big problems the last 3 weeks and why Syracuse has not scored a point in the first quarter. So on this podcast, we are talking about ways that Syracuse can fix some of their issues over the last few games. We just talked about how Syracuse can start games faster. Now coming up, we'll talk about the offensive and defensive lines. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Syracuse football, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, was a 1.5-point underdog at Boston College. And, well, credit to Boston College. They found a way to win the game, and I'm sorry to those that bet Syracuse to win because guess what? You're not going to be able to cash in on this deal. But just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen of the day. Click that like button, hit that subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. We just talked about how Syracuse football can start games faster. Now let's talk about the offensive and defensive line play. I will admit, this is not a 3-week issue, right? Starting faster, starting games on time for Syracuse, this is more of that's a 3-game problem. Right, that's like the last 3 games. They generally will start games pretty well, aside from Stanford, but generally they do. Offensive and defensive line, not so much. These are not exactly the strong suits of Syracuse football. And both lines against Boston College in the 37-31 loss had particularly bad games. They did not play well. I ripped them apart on yesterday's post-game podcast, okay? This is more toned down, a little bit more analysis in this one, right? Offensive line, let's start with versus Boston College. Kyle McCord was sacked 4 times, and as I mentioned yesterday, it might as well have been 10 because he was pressured all game long. LeQuint Allen only managed about 3 yards per carry. I'm sorry, but LeQuint Allen's a really good running back. It's not necessarily his fault. He only got 3 yards a carry, okay? They could not move anyone up front on that offensive line. Now, what can Syracuse do about the offensive line? All right, what can they do? Well, you could do a personnel change. Demetrius Weatherspoon, I'm sorry, you did not have the greatest game. Maybe you can put in David Wollaba at left tackle instead. You could do that, right? Something's wrong on the offensive line. Let's do a personnel change. But in my opinion, I don't think that solves the problem. I don't. You could try. It's trying something new, right? New personnel, maybe. But I don't think that solves the problem necessarily, okay? But you could try an actual personnel change, which is really just swapping the tackles, right? David Wollaba in at left tackle, Demetrius Weatherspoon out at left tackle on the bench. But I don't think it's going to magically solve the offensive line. I think one of the big problems is because this line is not the Great Wall of Dallas. When Syracuse football runs long developing plays and Kyle McCord is just sitting in the pocket, it doesn't go very well. It doesn't have to be the longest developing play. It doesn't have to be. It's just any play where the receivers have to run, or all of them have to run like 10 or more yards down the field. Generally does not go well for Syracuse football. It does not. And we're 9 games in, right? This is not a 3-week problem. We are 9 games in. I talked about I talked about last segment, rather. The strategies that Syracuse football can use on their offensive line to help them out. Because you could do a personnel change, but I don't think it's a magic wand. I don't. So what do? As I said on last segment, you can do more design rollout plays. You can do shorter routes. Try to establish the run, but at the same time, aside from Virginia Tech, which Virginia Tech can't really stop the run, in case you missed it, they're not a good run-stopping team. I don't know how you fix the run blocking, but going forward with this offensive line in terms of pass protection, I think you got to do what I said on the last segment. More design rollouts, a little bit more creativity, right? I love that screen call on the backside. I think that worked really well in the third quarter. Stuff like that. I think it'd help out the offensive line. It's not a magic potion here. I'm not a fairy waving a magic wand, but maybe it's a temporary fix, right? That's how you can help out the offensive line a little bit. As far as the defensive line against Boston College, oh, that was bad. I can't sugarcoat it. I can't. I'm sorry. It was just bad. Boston College had over 300 rushing yards. I believe over 7 yards a carry. It didn't go well on that defensive line. And look, stopping the run isn't just the defensive line. I understand that. It's not just the defensive line, right? The linebackers miss tackles. The safeties get miss tackles. The corners miss tackles. Everyone misses tackles. They all do. We know that Syracuse is not a particularly strong tackling team. We know that. We're 9 games in. But the reason why I'm calling out the defensive line is they're not getting penetration. They're not getting penetration. It's hard to ask, particularly defensive backs, to tackle a running back that's probably at least 20 to 30 pounds heavier, running full speed at you. It's hard. You'd like them to, but it's hard because this defensive line gets no initial push. None. If you watched that Boston College game yesterday, it's like their running backs, their first 5 yards, they're not touched. You don't see a Syracuse defensive lineman in the backfield redirecting the play or forcing the running back to redirect himself or stumbling a little bit. You don't see it at all. There's no pressure from this defensive front. There's no initial penetration. As far as stats-wise, right, Syracuse football gives up 155 rushing yards a game. That's not good at all. And what's worse is that they give up 4.93 rushing yards per carry. That's not good either. And I understand there are injuries, right? Kevin Jobity and Dion Wilson are out. Those are 2 of their better run stoppers. They're out for the season. Guess what? I just said they're out for the season. They're not coming back. They're not, right? So you're going to have to figure out how to do the rest of the season without those 2 guys. So what's the solution? How do you fix the problem here? Because I've already laid out they don't really stop the run well, okay? I see a lot of people saying, let's switch the scheme. Let's switch the scheme. Right now, they kind of run a 3-3-5, which means 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, 5 defensive backs. Could do that. And I see a lot of people ripping Elijah Robinson for not making the adjustments during the game. And here's my counter to that. I'm not going to defend Elijah Robinson and say that he's some great defensive coordinator guru. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am going to say is that the issue was not the in-game adjustments. You cannot force a defense. Who fixes a defensive scheme during a game? How often does that happen? Where a team will completely adjust their defensive scheme in like a quarter or in like a half. My issue isn't their in-game adjustment. My issue with them is they didn't run a different defense than the 3-3-5 heading into the game. It's more of a strategy and game plan problem rather than an in-game adjustment. Because I don't think you can say, all right, let's go from a 3-3-5 to a 4-3 during a game. I think that's asking too much. I think at that point, you're going to confuse your defense. And the last thing you want is confusion. When you're confused, it's over. You cannot be confused out there. You have to know what you're doing. It's one thing to know what you're doing and not execute. If you don't know what you're doing, it's game over. You're never going to have a chance. I think going forward, you got to run a 4-3 or at least try a 4-3 scheme. That's 4 down defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, and 4 players in the secondary, right? That's the math. Yeah. That's what I think Syracuse should try going forward. I can't guarantee it's going to solve the run defense. And if you run a 4-3, you are going to sacrifice a bit in the passing game. It's bound to happen. But I think you could try it. I think you certainly can try a 4-3 because I know that a 3-3-5 does not work. So maybe a 4-3 will work. If it doesn't, well, then you're out of luck. I think bottom line, though, I covered it better on yesterday's podcast and the post-game show at the end, talking about how you look. We'll go over it later on, off-season priorities, because we're still in the season, but they're really going to need to load up in the transfer portal, and hopefully they can get some guys in high school that are big-time recruits on the offensive and defensive lines. But for now, in this season, this is what they got. They can't change the personnel now. It's the players are on the team. That's it. So maybe you can try to adjust the scheme for next game against Cal. Could do that. I would go to 4-3 instead of 3-3-5, and hopefully that'll solve or at least temporarily fix the run defense. So on this podcast, we've talked about how Syracuse football can start games faster. We talked about the offensive and defensive lines. What now will make a successful season for Syracuse football? Basketball season has arrived, and whether it's the NBA, college, like, hey, Syracuse basketball, right? Basketball games are always exciting, and the way I get tickets for games is by using Gametime. Gametime is a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. My favorite feature is the curated deals. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app. Create an account and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. What is success for Syracuse football now? Leave a comment in the comment section below your thoughts on what would make a successful Syracuse football season right now at this very moment. As it stands, Syracuse football is 6-3, and they are 3-3 in the conference. Before the season, before the year started, my prediction was 8-4. In fact, I didn't waver from that prediction since last April. I was originally at 7-5. Then I bumped them up to 8-4, and I did not change. I didn't change it. I stuck with 8-4, okay? My ceiling for them was 10-2. Obviously, that can't happen anymore. They just lost their third game. But my absolute ceiling was if everything pretty much breaks right, they'll go 10-2. And my floor for them was 6-6. I highly doubt they will go 6-6, right? But I guess it's theoretically possible. I think for me, what would be a successful year is if they finish 2-1 down the stretch. That to me would be successful because it would be meeting the expectation that I personally had for them, right? I had them at 8-4 and they're at 6-3. If they go 2-1 down the stretch, they're 8-4. There we go, right? That would be successful in my book. If you had them winning 10 games, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry, but that doesn't mean they can't be successful in your idea, but you get the point. If they go 7-5, not that it would be the worst record in the world, right? I don't think 7-5 is a terrible year. I don't think it's bad at all. But with the upgraded talent on the roster, I understand it's a brand new coaching staff, but there's more talent on this roster, better recruiting, right? Good transfer portal class and everything like that. A one-game improvement from this season to last season with an easier schedule, in theory, I guess, easier schedule. It was an easier schedule than last year. I'm not going to call it a failure. It's not a failure, but it's not success in my book. Not a successful year. It's like a in-between. Kind of like a, okay, decent enough start to the Fran Brown era. All right? Let's look at their schedule. Next week, they're at Cal. I consider that a toss-up game. Right? We'll go over Cal later on in the week. I believe we'll do that. We'll do that at some point in the week. All right? UConn at home. All right. Can we all agree they're going to beat UConn at home? And can we all agree that if they don't beat UConn at home, there's a problem? This isn't basketball here. This is football. All right? I don't think they're going to lose to UConn at home. If they do, there's a big problem. We got a bigger problem on our hands. They lose to UConn. And then Miami to close the year. Miami's beatable. They literally just lost to Georgia Tech. They are beatable. They can be beat. They're not undefeated anymore, and they've played with fire a lot this season. They finally burned them. But Miami is going to be favored in that game. And being objective, being just honest with you right now as I record this, I'm actually recording this on Saturday night. You're watching this on Sunday. I think Miami is going to win that game. We're still a few weeks away from that. But I right now, as a totally objective, I think Miami would win that game. So basically, the key game is at Cal next week. That is a key game, right? If they win that one, they basically clinch an 8-win season, which would be a successful year in my book. But there's a caveat here. Not that they should lose to Cal or anything like that. I still expect them to win. I think another thing that's important is that you don't want to get blown out by Miami at home. You really don't. And I know you don't, look, nobody ever wants to get blown out. You don't want to get embarrassed, right? No, you don't want to get embarrassed by anyone. It doesn't matter who it is, right? I don't care who they're playing. But there's a specific reason why I'm saying that. The Miami game is the last game of the regular season. That's the last one. So enjoy it while it lasts. There's only 3 games left. They will have a bowl game, but Miami's the last game of the season. at least the regular season, all right? The early signing period in recruiting is December 4th, which is about a week after the Miami game. You do not want your final impression on the regular season right before the early signing period for high school recruits to be getting annihilated on your home field by one of the better programs in the country right now. You don't want that to be your last impression. First impression is very important, and your last impression is very important. What you do in the middle, yeah, it matters too. But first impression, last impression. You do not want to get embarrassed. Not that I would sit here and say I'd be, quote unquote, okay with them losing to Miami, right? We don't know what's going to happen between now and then. But don't get embarrassed by them. That's your last impression to make on recruits. Imagine if you win that game and recruits are watching and the early signing period's about to happen. Gee golly. Or he at least at minimum can keep it close. Okay. All right. It's that respect factor. You want to show respect. So I think that game's important, win or lose. Don't get blown out. Be competitive. Show some fight. You know, you lose the game by 6 points. You lose 51-45 because Cam Ward throws 6 touchdowns in the game. So be it. So be it. Don't get blown out in that one against Miami. So overall, for me, a successful year. You got to beat Cal. Then you got to obviously beat UConn. And then hopefully not getting blown out by Miami. So you finish 8-4. That's my opinion. Leave a comment in the comment section below what you think would make a successful season for Syracuse football right now at this very moment. As far as what is coming up on the podcast, all right, we've finally reached this point. What is coming up? Tomorrow, that is Monday, we will have not a full podcast. Okay, I'm going to take like a half day off. A 10 to 15 minute podcast previewing a basketball game. Syracuse is playing Colgate on Tuesday. So we'll have a mini podcast for that one. On Tuesday, well, there's a basketball game at night. We'll have a post-game reaction show, Syracuse basketball against Colgate. Hopefully they can beat Colgate. Wednesday, no full podcast. No mini podcast. I'm taking off on Wednesday. Thursday, Poll Friday is getting moved up to Thursday. And you might be asking yourself, why is it getting moved up to Thursday, right? We've seen Poll Friday being moved to Saturday at times. It happens. Why is it getting moved to Thursday? I'll tell you why. Because on Friday, we are going to have a full podcast on Friday because it's time. What am I referring to? It's time, right? What is it? Oh, yeah. Kyan Anthony's making his decision on Friday night. Syracuse is in that final 3. Really, it's the final 2 now, according to his dad, Carmelo Anthony. Syracuse and USC. We will find out on Friday night, and there will be a full podcast after that decision, whether it goes in Syracuse's favor or it does not. You can come here on Locked On Syracuse, and there will be a podcast reaction to Kyan Anthony's decision. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it's to Syracuse. And then on Saturday, this is going to be very busy. We got 2 post-game shows in the same day. Basketball first. They're playing a game, I believe, at 1 against Youngstown State. And then Football game is second on the day. They're playing at 3 o'clock at Cal. So there will be a post-game reaction show. 2 bowl games. How about that? Saturday, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a busy time here on Locked On Syracuse. So you know what you want to do? You want to hit the like button here, and then you want to subscribe to the channel because you want to know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. And everyone, take care.